when Mark first called me about giving a presentation, it was really focused on how do growers in the East Coast manage powdery mildew. And I was like, yeah, I can do that. That's no problem. And then he called me back in early December and said, wanted to expand that, talk a little bit more and talk more about holistically, how do you find inspiration from all over the world, and how do you take pieces from different parts of the world, wine growing areas, and bring them into Napa and have that affect your wine styles. So that's what I'm going to be focused on mainly today. So a little bit about me. For those of you who don't know me, I am relatively new to Napa, so I'm making the assumption that most people don't know who I am, but I'm originally from South Carolina. I graduated in 2006 from Cornell University with a bachelor's degree in viticulture. I am currently the Senior Director of Winemaking for the luxury wine side of Constellation. So primarily that's Robert Mondavi Winery here in Napa, but also Prisoner, Simi, Schrader, Mount Veeder, things like that. So I also own my own winery back in New York. It's very small. We're not even 200 cases, but it's a labor of love for me. So it's called Trestle 31. And then I was the first female winemaker in the United States to earn the title of Master of Wine back in 2017. So I was very excited about that. So I've been about 16 years in the industry now and really enjoy it. I love it. You guys know, it's an amazing place to be working. So focusing on why become a Master of Wine. Obviously, you don't need a Master of Wine to become a winemaker. You don't need a Master of Wine to become a successful winemaker. But for me, it was really getting out of my own box of what I was doing in my own winery. So it brings a worldwide perspective to winemaking because you have to really understand what's happening globally on the industry stage, not just what's happening in your own area. It gave me the ability to travel and taste very widely. You have to taste wines from, $3.99 bottles of White Zin all the way up to $1,000 bottles of, first growth Bordeaux, and you have to understand why they are situated in the marketplace where they are. So having that global understanding really helps, particularly when you're talking to marketing and salespeople, you speak the same language. A specific understanding of how wine styles are produced globally. So I have to know when I taste a wine blind, how that wine was made just from how it tastes in the glass. And so having that skill is really, really helpful because if I'm inspired by a wine, I can kind of break it down and go, all right, what did they do? How do I like that or not like that? And what can I bring to my winemaking from what they're doing? Like I said, strong emphasis in business, sales, and marketing. There's an entire section of the theory paper that is focused on that, and you have to show mastery of 3 different global markets of the globe. So obviously, US was a big one for me, the UK, and then also Asia. It's internationally recognized. I can go anywhere in the world and say I'm a master of wine, and people understand what that means. So that's been really nice. A lot of people go under the assumption that the Master of Wine is more of a trade designation, so salespeople, people who work in retail shops. But I wanted to point out that these are some recent research papers from Masters of Wine who are also winemakers and or involved in winemaking some way that really have key implications for what we do on a daily basis. So these are all usually available, unless they have sensitive business data, from the website of the Institute of Masters of Wine, and you can request them. And they are quite comprehensive. They have to be between 6,000 and 10,000 words of original research, so you can't redo something that a university has already done. It has to be new. So I just wanted to put some of these up there because some of them are really, really interesting. So as Mark pointed out, I make wine on both coasts. I make wine here in Napa. We live full-time here in Napa. But over the last, my 16-year career, I've been kind of bouncing back and forth between Napa and the Finger Lakes. So I started out my career on the East Coast in Pennsylvania and then worked my first 3 harvests in upstate New York in the Finger Lakes, moved out to California in 2006, and then moved to the North Coast in 2009. But in 2015, I got the opportunity to move back, and that's when we started our own brand out there. And then 2018, we moved back here. So I've done this cross-country move about 3 times now. But now, luckily, I'm able to do that on a plane and keep a foot on both coasts, which is really exciting. When you think about the differences and similarities between Napa and the Finger Lakes, I was recently asked, well, what's similar about the 2 climates? And I really had to rack my brain because there's not much. But what I came to the conclusion of is the influence of bodies of water is the only similarity that Napa and the Finger Lakes share. Pacific Ocean, obviously, for Napa, and the Finger Lakes themselves, plus a little bit of influence from Lake Ontario for the Finger Lakes. So again, making an assumption that you're not as familiar with the New York wine industry. The vineyards were first established in the 18th century. Currently, industry provides $11.5 billion to the state's economy, which is really critical because upstate New York is a very economically depressed area. So this is a real bright spot for the entire economy of New York. There's 405 bonded wineries making 13.4 million cases of wine annually. I know, it's small compared to what California does, but it's the #3 wine producing state in the country. So it may be way beyond California, but still significant. 54% of the state's grape harvest goes towards wine production. The rest goes toward juice, jellies, jams, things like that. Welch's is a big player there. So a lot of the Concord that you see on the grocery store market comes from that area. So I want to talk a little bit about the differences in Napa versus the Finger Lakes. So overall, annually, we get about the same amount of precipitation. When that precipitation shows up is the key difference. So here's 3 vintages, 17, 18, and 19, showing both the rainfall in St. Helena and the rainfall in Dresden, New York, which is on the west side of Seneca Lake, which is right in the middle of the Finger Lakes. So if you can see, 17 and particularly 19, very heavy rain load in the early part of the season in Napa. As you can see, the rest of the year is a pretty heavy rain load in the Finger Lakes. You can pretty much be guaranteed you're going to get at least one significant storm a week. And because of that, the disease pressure is quite high. Coming back to 2019 rainfall here, you can see January, February, and March were very, very high rainfall for St. Helena. And that's going to be important for something I'm going to talk about later. So I just want you to keep that in your mind. But I really just showed this for kind of a understanding of how the vintages are quite different. And particularly in 2018, you see that almost 6 inches in August. There were some areas of the Finger Lakes that had a record rainfall of 9 inches. And there was widespread flooding, and there were some vineyards that kind of slid down hills, and it was a little bit crazy. But again, high humidity during harvest and rain during harvest is just par for the course there. Some of you may be thinking, why does she make wine there? It's a challenge, and I like a challenge. So, vintage comparisons. So growing degree days. Napa is quite normalized. You don't really see huge vintage variation. So here's the growing degree days for 17, 18, and 19 for both St. Helena, California, and Dresden, New York. As you can see, not much activity in New York before April, and that's when it starts to warm up. But we typically, we don't always catch up, but usually harvest is around the same time as it is out here. But interestingly enough, in 2018, St. Helena and Dresden were almost at the same growing degree days in the fall, which was, I think, a key indicator of how warm that vintage was. And then you think about adding the rain into that, that was a lot of mildew we were dealing with that year. So Chardonnay East and West, it's the only variety I make on both coasts, so it's the only option I have to show you a comparison of what we did last year. So this is 2019 harvest data. So the Carneros Chard is for our reserve Chardonnay program at Robert Mondavi Winery. The Finger Lakes Chard is for my own brand, Trestle 31. So harvest dates are really not that dissimilar. The key thing about harvesting fruit in the Finger Lakes is you don't choose when you harvest your grapes. The weather chooses for you, and then you deal with whatever you end up with. So you can see, difference in bricks is key, and also the difference in the acid. The Finger Lakes is a very cooled climate, so the acid's quite high. Carneros, a little bit warmer. I bet, for those of you who work in Carneros, this is the only time anybody will talk about it being a warmer climate, right? And a little bit lower acid than you see there. So thought it would be interesting to compare the two from both coasts. So coming back to the 2019 harvest in Napa. Here are the key things that I thought were really defining about last harvest. So the weather during bloom was a little bit unsettled, and so in certain varieties we saw uneven set which led to uneven ripening within clusters, particularly in Sauvignon Blanc and some Chardonnays, and Pinots were kind of hit and miss, and we'll get into why that was. Higher humidity than normal, particularly in the Carneros region. We saw a lot of powdery issues last year, and I really do believe that was because the growers in this area may not be accustomed to dealing with the levels of humidity and disease pressure that maybe areas like New York are used to dealing with. High levels of anthocyanins peaking early ahead of later ripening tannins and flavors, which generally led to a pretty high Brix level at harvest. And also I wanted to touch on the difference in extractability between 2019 Cabernet fruit and 2018 Cabernet fruit. And of course, the key thing at the end of the season are these external factors that we're dealing with now, power outages, fires, things like that, which I believe are gonna be part of our life going forward out here. So bloom weather, 2019, I'm sure you all remember this, but there was a period in mid-May that was very cool for that time period, and we also got a late rainstorm, which did, I believe, impact some of the fruit set on the earlier blooming varieties. Then about 3 weeks later, we came back and had 4 days at 100 degrees, which happened right around when the Cabernet was blooming. So it's, again, hit and miss as whether that impacted vineyards or not, but we did see some vineyards were fine, other vineyards we really had to be careful of our sampling procedures to get an accurate Brix going into harvest. So, lessons from the East, dealing with mildew. This was what my original talk was supposed to be on. Unfortunately, this is Chardonnay down in Carneros last year. So it was pretty aggressive. So anything you can do in the vineyard to reduce your humidity influences. I know most people don't have perennial cover crops on the West Coast, but if you do have some sort of perennial cover crop, you really want to try to break that down as much as possible to reduce the humidity in the vineyard itself. Open air flow around the clusters, so leafing is key here. Being vigilant about your spray program. Growers in New York, you're on the tractor every 14 days regardless. You know there's a disease pressure, you know it's gonna happen. You just gotta be out there. But it's important to rotate chemicals so you don't have the resistance issues. So if you cannot repeat a chemical during the entire growing season, that's the goal. I know there's differences between the chemicals available in California and New York for these types of issues, but the hope is that you don't use one chemical twice in the season. And then when you are spraying, assuming you can mix in wettable sulfur, do it. It's cheap insurance. Just throw it in there, and assuming it gets along with the main chemical, just throw it in. So moving on to Cabernet. So all of these blocks are blocks from Tokelon for Robert Mondavi Winery. So this is anthocyanin accumulation in Cabernet for 2019 last year. So one of the things we're seeing into Northwest and T-West are later ripening due to some virus load. So you see at the very beginning of October last year, we had that really strong heat spike with the very, very low humidity. And it really had a major effect on anthocyanins. So if you hadn't picked by that point, and some people had started picking, we're typically an earlier Cabernet picker, you were able to capture the high anthocyanins early before that heat spike hit. But once the heat spike hit, you can really see that the level of anthocyanin composition in the fruit really went down pretty dramatically. And so the issue there is the flavors and the tannin profile was not quite ripe enough to pick everything early. I mean, we were seeing Brix levels of 26 and maybe 27 on average last year for when we're harvesting, which is much later and much higher than we typically harvest, which is normally around a 25 Brix level. So I just thought that was interesting to see how the tannin or the color composition reacted in the fruit to that heat spike. So this is one of our blocks. It's called Twilight. This is a Pure Vine vigor zone map. And one of the new things we tried last year was harvesting by vigor zone. Previously, we had been harvesting by row. And as you can see, it's an incredibly variable block. And so making a harvest decision on this has been very challenging throughout history since it's been planted. I believe it was planted in 2012, so it's younger for the vineyard, but they're very, very long rows, and so trying to get a uniform sample to make a proper picking decision off of is very challenging. And also when we looked at the high vigor versus low vigor vines, we didn't really see that much of a difference in Brix accumulation or pH or acid or YAN. So we were operating under the assumption that, well, if all of those things that we can quickly measure for are the same, then maybe the variation isn't as pronounced as we thought it was. But what we did this year is by separating it into these vigor zones, we were able to see that there actually is a pretty significant difference in anthocyanin accumulation to the fruit. So this is 2 blocks of Tokalon into South and Twilight. You can see the difference between 2018 and 2019. And this data all comes from Wine X-ray. They've been fantastic to work with, both Scott McLeod and Gianni. I'm sure they're here somewhere. Hi, guys. Thank you so much for all this. This is great stuff. So you see the total anthocyanin accumulation for 2018 was much higher than you saw in 2019. But also on Twilight, you can see that the accumulation between the zones, the north zone, which was the yellow, less vigorous zone, and the south zone, the north zone was the more vigorous zone, and the south zone was the less vigorous zone. You can see that the anthocyanin accumulation is quite different. So even though the inherent analysis, the Brix, the TA, the pH, things like that were equal, the composition of the fruit was not. And so by separating it into these zones, we can now more targeted pick for when those zones are ripe and or when those zones, anthocyanins, are peaking. So the real trick to last year was trying to figure out what was more important. Was color more important? Was flavor more important? Was tannin ripeness more important? And by having this type of data, we can see and make those decisions in a really real-time fashion versus just looking at your historical Brix TA pH analysis and then going out and tasting, which we also do, but it's an extra tool in the toolbox. So looking at extractability, 2018 to 2019, what we saw in our wines is that 2019 was less extractable than 2018. 2018 just gave you everything it needed to do really early in the fermentation. And so it was very easy to over-extract towards the end. So making sure that we were monitoring how quickly things were extracting was really critical for us in 2018. 2019, we saw it was a little bit less critical because things were coming out of the fruit slower. We were able to do more aggressive pump overs for longer during the fermentation without drying out the wines. So this is into South. So you see we kind of ended up at the same total anthocyanin accumulation from the fermentation, but as 2018, but it took us longer to get there in 2019 than it did in 2018. This is the tannin as well. So again, you see the same extractability happening very early in 2018 versus a little bit later in 2019 also. So I just wanted to say thank you so much to not only the Vintage Report team for having me here, the Wine X-ray team, but Sam Filler, who's the executive director of the New York and Wine and Grape Foundation, who got me all the economic stats, Hans Walter Peterson, who's the viticulture extension specialist of the Finger Lakes Grape Program for Cornell. He got me all the rainfall stats and everything for the Finger Lakes. Seth Schwebs, who's our director of viticulture at Constellation, who helped me compile the weather data and everything for St. Helena. Peter Bell and August DeMel, my project in New York wouldn't be possible without the help from those guys, so they're amazing. The winemaking team at Robert Mondavi Winery, our whole team is just an amazing, well-oiled machine, and it's so amazing to work with all of y'all, so thank y'all. And again, the Napa Vintage Report team for having me. So I'm happy to take any questions that you have. Yes?
What was your vinification protocol, 18 versus 19? Full maceration? Sorry. I'm on the mic. What was your vinification protocol, 18 versus 19? Was there a difference in cold soak, turns on the tanks, anything that led to this difference in extractability?
No, the protocol is exactly the same. So we just see the peaks later in 2019 than we did in 2018. So it's generally a 5 to 8 day cold soak on these wines, and then pretty aggressive pump overs early in the fermentation, maybe 3 turns per day. And then later we cut it back a little bit more to maybe 1.5 turn per day fermentation management. Did anybody type in Slido? I can get up too. Yes.
Did you see a difference in berry weights from 18 to 19?
Yes, and I meant to talk about that. So the question was about berry weights from 18 to 19. When I said look at the rainfall early in 19, I think that had a significant impact on berry weights because the berry weights in 19 were much higher than they were in 2018. 2018, we were seeing around 0.8 to 0.9 grams per berry in Cabernet, and 2019, it was up around 1 gram per berry. So I do believe that had something to do with the differences, yeah. Yes?
For these blocks, how much accumulated irrigation happened on them over the growing season?
How much accumulated irrigation happened over the growing season? That's an excellent question that I don't know off the top of my head. But I have to ask the vineyard team how much, yeah. Yes?
Did you see also difference between total tannin extraction?
Total tannin extraction, the question was, is there a difference between the total tannin extraction between 18 and 19? The answer is no. But the timing of the extraction changed. So if you're aggressively pumping over in 2018, you could end up with way more tannin than you want in the final wine. Versus 2019, it was easier to do those pump overs longer without ending up with a lot of tannin. And To Kalon is all tannin, so managing tannin is a really key part of what we do. Yes?
Did you get similar bound numbers between the vintages?
Similar bound numbers, that's a great question. We're still working on seeing where our final bounds are ending up on 2019. 2018, we did see higher bounds than we did in previous vintages we've been working on, which is one of the things we've been working towards. So that was a success. But the vintage 2019 is yet to be determined how we finally end up. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Nova.